Is there anything you would have done differently?
We reported a true story.
Our colleague Brian Williams is back in Kuwait City tonight after a close call in the skies over Iraq.
Controversial Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh and questions about Kavanaugh's drinking in the past.
Sean Hannity, come on up, Sean Hannity.
Today, Andrew Cuomo is having a moment.
Hi, I'm Chris Steyerwalt.
And I'm Eliana Johnson.
Heck yeah, you are. Welcome to Ink-Stained Wretches, where we break down what's going wrong and what's going right with the American news media. Eliana Johnson, it's an interview edition. It's a very special interview edition.
It is, because we have with us my former colleague and your current colleague at both the Dispatch and the American Enterprise Institute, Jonah Goldberg. Jonah and I worked together at National Review. But Jonah is not just now of the Dispatch and AEI. He is also a contributor to CNN. And previously, Jonah, you've had so many affiliations. Previously with Fox News. Mm-hmm. Am I missing any other ones? LA Times columnist.
LA Times columnist.
The Glop podcast.
The Glop podcast with Ricochet. And from 2001 to 2004, I was back at CNN. And...
New York Times bestselling author.
Sure, there's that. Former London Times columnist.
That's a good one.
Friggin' peons.
Quite sad.
Proles.
And I think the only thing I
Former media critic at Brill's Content. I forgot about that.
Oh.
Really?
Yep. House boy at Brill's Content.
Dag nabbit. That was, I thought Brill's Content was super cool. When I was, what year was that? Probably
99 to like 2004-ish.
Yeah, I was just out of college, and I just thought Brill's Content was so cool, and I thought I hoarded the little magazines. I thought it was super cool.
You were the one.
I was the guy.
Yeah.
And the only thing I really want to grill you on is going to be the caricatures, the new caricatures for the Dispatch.
Fair.
And why I look like a person in my caricature who has to get his neighbors to sign a form before he can move into the neighborhood. I don't know.
So
if you're not happy with me and what I'm doing at the Dispatch, just tell me. Don't give me the
No,
Mr.
but tell
Furley.
it on the podcast. But Jonah, you got into conservative media in the 1990s and are still in it. And so I think nobody's had, or very few people have had a better vantage point of watching and being a firsthand witness to all these changes. So thank you so much for being with us.
And like Andrew Sullivan, who's been here before, Jonah is one of the godfathers of blogging.
Yes.
One of the people who made that part of the thing when you were, I believe you were a whippersnapper.
I was a whippersnapper. I was the founding editor of National Review Online. And I was the creator of The Corner, which was the first big group blog, which our old friend Andrew Breitbart, with total attribution, stole that idea for the original Huffington Post.
Yeah.
So in internet years, I am Methuselah.
And for people like me, let's see, I'm almost 40. Like, I grew up reading all of that stuff and played a huge role on my decision to become a journalist and reporter, and like in my ideological formation.
Eliana, how many times do you want me to apologize?
That's right. Speaking of having to fill out a form to move into the neighborhood.
Well, Jonah, I want to ask you just a few things about your personal background, because you had such an interesting entryway into journalism. And I'm curious, when and how did you actually start to think of yourself as a journalist and think this is really what I want to do?
Sure. So if we're going to talk about this, we have to go to the before times. I've been actively under my own byline, a journalist in conservatism since the late 90s, maybe a little earlier if you count some things. But I grew up in a lot of this, right? So my dad was a newspaperman, syndicate guy, editor, media executive. He always used to joke that he worked from behind enemy lines because he was a conservative in the business. My mom was a much more flamboyant person, but she too was conservative. She was arguably the first successful conservative literary agent before she went on to do all sorts of other things. And so when I tell people, I usually do it as a joke, but it's funny because it's true. When I talk about my bona fides in conservatism, forget journalism for a second, I go way back. I always Chris has heard me say it many times. I often tell people, look, I go way back. I literally met Pat Buchanan at my bris. The
thought of Pat Buchanan at a bris is...
I know. There
that
wheels
is
within
like
wheels
out of
there.
a Tom Wolfe
I know.
novel.
So Rob Long was the first one, when I first joked about that. Rob Long, my co-podcaster on GLOP, he was like, this might explain a lot of Pat's views about the Jews.
Look at what they're doing to this baby.
But yeah, so like Pat introduced my dad to, my dad, Victor Lasky, big time 1960s right-wing muckraking journalist, wrote a famous book called It Didn't Start with Watergate, JFK, the Man and the Myth, introduced Pat Buchanan to my dad by saying, Sid, I want you to meet Pat Buchanan. He's a terrific red baiter. And he meant it totally as a compliment. So that's the world I kind of came from. I absorbed a lot of this stuff through osmosis. I didn't want to be a journalist. I always sort of thought that being a journalist was being an observer rather than a participant in life. But it turns out that I absorbed way too much of it. And so I was the editor of school newspaper and all that kind of stuff. And
In high school or college?
In college. In college. Where, as you've heard me talk about many times, I was the Rosa Parks of gender integration.
Yes, at Vassar College, right?
No, Goucher College.
Goucher College.
Which is all women's college in Baltimore County. And
that must have been a real hardship for you, Jonah, being the only man surrounded by hundreds of women.
I wasn't the only man. There were 30 odd men, and I do mean
and I bet they're
odd men, because like a big chunk of the male student body, they thought like basically their only way to have intimate relations with a female was to go to an all-women's college. And so there's a lot of self-selection going on in that decision-making process.
Yeah.
But we don't need to dwell on all that. And so my first job out of college, I went to Prague. I wanted to be a starving writer. I didn't starve and I didn't write, so batted 500. Came back here, and my first real job was working for a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, Ben Wattenberg. And he was a syndicated columnist. I learned a lot from that job, including that I didn't want to work for Ben Wattenberg anymore. And
why?
So it's complicated. I've never told the full story.
This is, by the way, I would just say for people who are not Jonah Goldberg completists, in the universe of untold Goldbergian lore, the full telling, and Jonah hints at it in interviews with other Wattenberg survivors.
Yeah.
It is discussed. It is there in the Arcana, but it never said.
It's sort of like, when you see someone you were in prison with and you talk about, that time where we took care of the guard. You don't really want to,
you don't want to live there.
Well, part of it, I know this is actually a sincere thing, is like, it was a great opportunity. It put me on a whole life path. I love AI. Ben was not a bad person. He was a very difficult person to work for. And there's a certain amount of ingratitude about doing it. And so even though he's passed away a few years, it's uncomfortable. But like my closest friends to this day are this small group of people I worked with in those days when I was a producer for Ben Wattenberg's television show, Think Tank, which was a PBS show. So my real entree into conservative journalism as a career came through Ben.
And the Think Tank show, so that was your first TV.
Yeah.
That was where you got to TV. How long was that show on? Did it work?
So I think the concept was great. The whole idea was one topic per show. So not like normal political shows where it's like 4 different topics.
Right.
And the general rule is, which maybe this will be received poorly on Ink Stained Wretches, was no journalists and no politicians. So like you actually had to have people who knew what they were talking about.
Okay.
And part of the problem was I don't think Ben was the right host for it.
Okay.
But what was great for me about it was it sort of took the same thing about being a research assistant for a syndicated columnist, is I got to wildly multiply my dilettantism. Because every week there was another topic where homeless policy, welfare policy, whatever, where I had
just
to do
like being a journalist.
Very much so, right. I had to do huge deep dives on, figure out who the important intellectuals are in that space, and write scripts, do setup pieces. And then I moved on to the next topic in the next week. And that was a great experience for me professionally. And I did some freelance writing back then, wrote my first pieces for commentary in the public interest. My first op-ed ever on election day, the day after the election, 1992. If you open up the Wall Street Journal, you will find an op-ed by William Bennett, another one by Newt Gingrich, and a third one by Jonah Goldberg.
And you were 22,
something like
22.
that.
Nice.
Yeah, and it was on why we desperately needed to expand the House of Representatives.
And you were right.
To 7,000 people. And I have stuck by this.
7 seems high.
It's high. I mean, maybe not overnight, but at the time I was just trying to make, basically, true story. The thing that got me into punditry was George Will came to AEI to give a talk. I asked a question during the Q&A for this Bradley lecture thing, where I floated this idea because he was touting term limits, and I was like, wouldn't a better idea be to expand Congress because you could do this, that, and the other, blah, 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 blah. I don't need to rehearse the argument here. And he basically humiliated me and called me an idiot. And I was so pissed off about it that I went fuming like the Phantom of the Opera to my little Mac SE computer and worked for weeks on end on I was going to prove George Will wrong. And that kind of was one of the things that gave me the bug. So that was my first op-ed ever.
How did you end up at National Review, where you were for 25 years?
21 years.
21 years, okay.
I haven't, someone will check my math, but it's over 2 decades. So I was technically not working at AEI anymore, but we were renting space in the AEI building along with this little company called Slate. We shared offices for the television production company that I worked for. I had stopped working even on Ben's TV show, which I had begged to do for a long time. And I was producing some documentaries. I produced a documentary called Gargoyles, Guardians of the Gate. Do not ask me what gate. I have no idea. And
was it pro or anti-gargoyle?
It was a love letter to the gargoyle.
A love letter to the
and
gargoyle.
I can talk for quite a bit about what gargoyles are. But anyway, did another one on Cathedral Notre Dame and some other stuff. I was actually working on a infomercial series of things on the graphing calculator for community college math teachers because I was take any work I could that wasn't working for Ben anymore. And
the
then,
TRS 80 and you.
As I had mentioned earlier, my mom was a literary agent, and she had gotten to have this relationship, professional friendship, whatever, with Linda Tripp, and who was the lady who befriended Monica Lewinsky. And I had had a couple of those meetings between Linda and my mom in one of 2 apartments that I had at various times in Washington, D.C., and then the Monica Lewinsky thing explodes with Drudge and all that. And it turns out that it is somewhat difficult to be implicated in a alleged conspiracy to bring down a Democratic president and be a producer who does most of their work with public television.
Yeah.
And I had written freelance stuff for National Review. I knew those guys. Rich Lowry had just taken over. And so...
Is that right?
Yeah. Was that around
Rich
then.
Lowry was 9 years old when he took over?
It was like, I think he took over in 97, and that's a whole other story.
Where is he getting his T cells? This is
yeah, wow. Well, he one of the things we've always done at National Review, Eliana can attest to this, is we've always had blood boys.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Where you have a constant IV from one of the interns. It's very helpful. But I mean, look at Ramesh Ponnuru.
I mean, ageless.
He's like might as well be a junior in high school. So anyway, and one of the things I needed after a little while of doing all these Larry King things was it was kind of humiliating and annoying, and I'm not going to.
When you say these Larry King things,
I was on Larry King a lot talking about the Clinton stuff,
and you were there as to defending your mom,
defending my mom, making the case, but Chiron was like Lucianne Goldberg's son, and I'm like a 27-year-old guy. I have these other experiences. That got kind of old, and so I worked out a deal with Rich because he had been calling me as a source during all this stuff, and we worked out a deal where I was a contributing editor, and so it was like 98, early 98, something like that, and so in the beginning, I got paid I think $1 a word. to write for the magazine on occasion, and I started doing this diarist, which Rich and I spent exactly 4.5 minutes trying to come up with a name for, which we ended up calling the Goldberg File. And originally it was just a diarist thing. It was before the word blog existed, where I would update it on the day while we were following the scandal, the impeachment brouhaha, and all that kind of stuff. And that became very popular, more popular than the site itself, which was still very embryonic, basically a placeholder site. And about 6 months into it, Ed Capano, who's then the publisher of National Review, and Rich called me and said, hey, how'd you like to be the editor of the website? And I don't remember if we were going to call it National Review Online then, but that's what it became. And so I was the founding editor of National Review Online. And one of the, I mean, if people are looking for career advice about all this, one of the things I did very quickly was branch out from just covering the Clinton stuff, because that's a very narrow lane, and I had other things to say. And prior to NRO, I was a very deliberate, slow writer, took a lot of time, agonized over things, wrote many drafts. And one of the great things about being thrown into the deep end of blogging, what became known as blogging, was I learned to write fast. And there's a famous line by A.J. Liebling, longtime New Yorker guy, who said he could write faster than anyone who could write better, and he could write better than anyone who could write faster. I'm not making that claim about myself, but that's the space I compete in, because I can write a lot now. And I learned that all from being pushed into the deep end with all that.
What you say is interesting, and I'm going to skip way forward because there's so much I want to ask you about.
I apologize
and in many
for
ways,
filibustering.
well, no,
Yeah.
in many ways, I think a lot of the super interesting stuff is present day, is like in the very past and in the present day. So you grew up like in the conservative firmament, as did I in a lot of ways. Like my dad is conservative, and
One of the great bloggers.
I always get asked.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
I always get asked, and I'm curious about you. Like, did you ever rebel against it? You know, you've been a dissenter in many ways in the modern day, but did you ever as a kid?
I just had no desire to do this stuff. This was just like the stuff talked about at the dinner table. It was stuff that my mom and dad talked about over martinis or cigarettes or whatever. And I just sort of absorbed it. And I wanted to write science fiction and comic books. That was my plan.
This explains a lot.
And I got pulled into this stuff, and I got the bug. I didn't realize until I went to college how much I actually knew about politics, because we didn't talk about it much in high school, but then all of a sudden people are talking about politics stuff. And it turns out that, like, you know, my dad was a very smart, very learned guy. My mom was a very savvy, very plugged in person. And they talked shop all the time. And that's where I first got it.
Let me posit something. So both of you grew up with parents who were part of the conservative movement, and identifiably so, right? Your dad, how old were you when your dad, and tell people who your dad is.
Well, it's a little different because, so my dad's an attorney who, on the side of his job as an attorney in a non-political, you know, my dad was at a law firm, then he went in-house at a bank, and he was writing for National Review and newspapers on the side. So for him,
what was
it was
the name
like
of his
a
blog?
passion.
Powerline.
He still has it.
Yeah.
Powerline. And so for him, it was like a side interest, but a real one. But I would say similar to the way Jonah described his dad, he's bookish and learned and interested not just in politics, but in literature and music and movies, and was a resource for that. And when people say, "Oh, did you rebel against it?" For me, I went to these super liberal schools.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
I would come home and say, "Well, this is what happened in school, and this is what happened in college." And my dad would just sort of say, "You should check out this book, or you should."
I grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan.
Right.
I was just,
And so
my
the
rebellion had other opportunities.
that was exactly the same as I had the desire to be troublemaking in the broader culture, as opposed to in my house.
You were already part of a rebellion, right? If you all had grown up in Ohio County, West Virginia, just think you'd be who knows what would have become of you. You would have drifted off, but you were born into a thing that felt rebellious, which feels good. And I think I think rebellious people, iconoclastic people, are drawn to journalism. I think there's something appealing about being the skunk at the garden party and doing that. And so you had growing up with, one of two Nixon voter, you're 50% of Nixon's vote share in your precinct resided in your home.
Something like that.
Yeah.
So Jonah,
Pauline Kael hardest hit.
We were both at National Review during 2016 when Trump was nominated, and National Review did this big issue against Trump. And then Trump won the nomination, and there was a sort of coming around to he's the better of the two candidates. And you decided a couple years later, was it 2019?
We launched the Dispatch in 2019.
2019, that's what I thought. To leave and go found your own thing. Can you talk a little bit about the decision to do that? Obviously, part of it's a desire to do your own thing. Part of it had to be a sort of dissatisfaction with what was happening there. I was already gone, so I did not have a first-hand seat.
Yeah, you'd sold out to the mainstream media by then.
I totally sold out to the mainstream, and I've now come back into the fold.
And I just for context on the question, Jonah, and because this is our podcast, this does not apply to my compliment ration for the year. Jonah had, from where we're talking about with the founding of the Corner and becoming NRO and doing all of that stuff, Jonah had transited to being not the editor of National Review, but the spirit animal of National Review, the most identifiable person when you thought about, okay, what's National Review all about? Jonah Goldberg, and it was a puckish, sometimes pugnacious, fun, culturally astute kind of conservatism. And Jonah was more than the hood ornament. He was that's where it felt like the ethic, and especially as the online portion of National Review came and supplanted a
little bit looser.
Yeah, a little bit looser.
Not your father's National Review is the way we refer to this concept, with rejecting all of the compliments about me.
Stipulated.
So what constraints did you not want to operate under anymore, and what did you want to found that was new and different?
Sure. So to be really clear about this, some of my dearest friends are still at National Review. I may have a disagreement here or there with one person or another person, all that kind of stuff, but I was a very strong, vigorous internal lobbyist for the against Trump issue. I wouldn't say it was my baby by any stretch, because that was really, I think it's fair to say Rich was the editor. Rich took the lead on it. It was Rich's decision. And but I was very much in favor of it. I was very much against Trump. Sometimes people call it the Never Trump issue. Never Trump was not a term that existed yet.
Right.
Right. And so I think it was one of NR's best moments. I think it's a very enjoyable process to go and look at all the pieces in that issue.
Yes.
See how so many people have grown after writing their contributions.
Yes.
And I have a lot of my more passionate anti-Trump friends get very angry at some people at National Review, including Rich Lowry. I've always defended Rich on this. Again, don't agree with him on everything, but again, he's been a friend. He gave me my start at NR. Being the editor of National Review, there has always been an element of keeping peace amongst the tribes kind of thing. That was certainly a role that William F. Buckley played. There's always a front of the house, back of house kind of tension there. And part of the point of National Review, and really part of the spirit of the Corner, which, again, I helped create, was to show that there's a lot of ideological heterogeneity on the right, that not all conservatives think in lockstep about everything. And so having competing voices is perfectly fine and all that. I made it clear to Rich very early on that, I'm just going to write what I think is true. And he gave me space to do that. True story, he really leaned heavily hard on Kevin Williamson to stop referring to Trump's sons as Uday and Kusei.
Never change, Kevin Williamson. Never change.
And Kevin's now a writer for the Dispatch. But for the most part, it wasn't that I felt constraints. It's that I didn't feel I could be my full self without creating problems for an institution I loved and friends and colleagues who I respected and liked a great deal, but maybe disagreed with about some things. And the other reasons why I wanted to start the Dispatch was I was of an age, right? I'd been in NR for like 20 years, where like I'm sort of in a rut. I feel like I'm being a little bit of a burden to this institution.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of my heroes growing up, I gave short shrift to it earlier, but when I came to AEI, I was a very intense autodidactic conservative nerd, and I read a lot of stuff, and like Irving Kristol, Father of Bill, William F. Buckley, a lot of my heroes were institution creators, and I had never done anything like that. And one of the things that I wanted to do was sort of model behavior that I thought was lacking on the right. I had been a big defender. I used to, do this whole thing when people say, why don't you condemn Ann Coulter or Glenn Beck or this Yabo or that Yach? And I would say, look, conservatism is like a symphony. You need the fine woodwinds of Charles Krauthammer, and you also need the dude in a thong smashing a hammer into a gong. That's how you get the full rich symphony, and I would defend everybody. I felt that with the rise of Trump in particular, the gong smashers had taken over the right. Mm-hmm. And the right had lost the desire in large part to persuade anybody. It was very insular, where people just basically talked to audiences that already agreed with them. And this is sort of the point of my last book, is like I kind of took it to heart. I kind of had this thing where I said, we got to start trying to persuade people who disagree with us rather than just feeding red meat to people who already agree with us. And there were other reasons why Steve Hayes and I launched the Dispatch, but that was a big part of my sort of I'm ready for this new stage kind of thinking.
The maturity of the conservative media, or relative immaturity. When you started The Corner, when you were among those starting The Corner, and you were doing that, and we've talked about this before, the idea of an insurgency that needed to be united, that had to have this united front, and that National Review is the single most important part of it, right? The national magazine, this thing. And then talk radio comes in alongside, and Fox News comes in alongside, and the Washington Times comes in alongside. But still the energy is, we are the only voice disrupting. We are the only gainsay to the firmament of the mainstream media. And as we move deeper into the 21st century, you start to see that there is actually lots of stuff on the right, and some of it's good and some of it's bad, but it's not one thing anymore, and that has to do with how many more platforms and places that people can do it.
I agree with that.
So when you guys founded the Dispatch, you and Steve, you wrote a founding manifesto, and you guys wrote, the goal was to create a place where thoughtful readers can come for conservative, fact-based news and commentary that doesn't come either through the filter of the mainstream media or the increasingly boosterish media on the right. Not only do we have too much noise and not enough signal, but the signals we should be heeding are often discounted as noise, and the noise is marketed as prophecy. I was wondering if I could get you to expound on that.
Sure.
Let's take today. What are the signals we should be heeding, and what noise is being marketed as prophecy?
Sure. I mean, so today is Thursday, May 23. Within the last 48 hours, a irresponsible jabroni named Julie Kelly found some boilerplate in some court documents that were released, and started this chain reaction that led to an enormous number of people on the right not just insinuating, but outright declaring that Joe Biden tried to assassinate Donald Trump.
I'm sorry, what?
Have you missed this?
I've been in a jabroni free zone, apparently.
So they found there's apparently boilerplate language. We have a good piece about this up on the Dispatch by Mike Warren. There's boilerplate language whenever the FBI gets a search warrant. It's been there for at least 20 years. That lays out. It's sort of like when you're gonna jump, when you're gonna do something crazy, like go on a bungee jump.
You're signing the waiver.
You sign the waiver. It's like this is like acknowledging to the FBI agents that if you encounter deadly force, you may have to use deadly force. And it's boilerplate. And there's an old rule that says if you don't know anything, everything seems like a conspiracy.
Mm-hmm.
Julie Kelly finds this boilerplate, and turns it into Joe Biden and Merrick Garland had authorized the FBI to use deadly force when they searched Mar-a-Lago to kill Donald Trump.
Oh boy!
It gets picked up by the House Judiciary Committee. It gets picked up by Dan Bongino and Charlie Kirk and all these kinds of people. And now the Trump campaign is actually raising money on this claim that they tried to assassinate him. That's a lot of noise. It's a lot of right? And I apologize.
No, that's okay. Colin will beep this out.
Okay.
He will do it. He will not fail.
They can figure out what the beep is from context. And
I just want to make clear, you curse away.
In many ways, I am the prude of this operation for sure.
Fair enough. And so anyway, there's an enormous amount of that kind of crap that goes on the right these days that bounces around all over the place, that gets picked up, that gets signal boosted on, if not Fox, then certainly places like Newsmax and all that kind of thing. It often, peters out on its own nonsense, but in the process, there are a whole bunch of people who cling to it, and it feeds into this hothouse atmosphere. So, that's an example of the kind of noise on a regular basis. I think the signal is tougher because we are in a moment where public policy and issues actually do not matter at all. No one is going to vote for Joe Biden or for Donald Trump because of some tweak to entitlements or any of these other things. This is purely an emotional kind of culture war driven thing. And frankly, I'm just tired of it, and so we kind of, part of the problem with, I think that I'll back up. So I've never really cared a lot about journalism. I'm not one of these Columbia J School people who thinks it's a fascinating topic or anything like that. I've done my share of media criticism, don't get me wrong, and I live in this world, right? So that's all fine. But one of the things I resent about this era is that I don't think anybody who's read me over the last 25 years, they immediately think that I am the eat your spinach, wag your finger, this is bad journalistic ethics guy. That's never been my role. And I feel like I've been kind of pushed into it by the place that we're in. And one of the things that kind of
I know just how you feel.
One of the things that kind of radicalized me was being a denizen at, as a Fox News contributor. I would spend
we're going to get there.
Yeah, was in 2015 and 2016 watching an enormous number of people, the technical word for it in social sciences, lie their asses off about what they thought about Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And they would literally say one thing in the green room and say something else once they got on TV. And the thing I didn't care about wasn't journalism, but I do care pretty passionately about the conservative intellectual movement and about conservatism generally. And I think that one of the places that conservatism has gotten itself into trouble, and I say this advisedly with lots of reservation because I'm describing it sometimes some of my favorite people in the world who I agree with on vast numbers of things, and I think they have an intense and deep and sincere integrity. But I think they make a categorical mistake, and you can hear it sometimes where they'll be saying things like, talking about some election, and think, I think we can win this one.
Yeah.
And the problem is you get conservative intellectuals who think their job is to be a political consultant for the Republican Party. And that is that can lead you down all sorts of bad paths of motivated reasoning, of not necessarily deceitfulness, although that has certainly happened, but of shading, because you start to think that your job is to be a booster for a party rather than a booster or an explainer of ideas. And that where those lines are have become so knotted and overlapping on the right that I think the right, a large chunk of the conservative intellectual movement, sees itself as as functionally an adjunct of the Republican Party. And it's not supposed to be that way. That's not how National Review was founded. I'm not saying there's not a role for that. There's always been a role for that. The New Republic was in many ways sort of an adjunct of the Democratic Party. It was also a great magazine. I'm just saying that there's very little on the right that isn't that. That isn't sort of, what are we going to do for the Republicans today? And I had no problem with it for most of my career because I basically agreed with Republicans and thought they were better than the Democrats. And I still, on all sorts of issues, I'm still a conservative in all sorts of ways. But Donald Trump was the testing point for that. Because all of a sudden you got people who knew that Donald Trump was an utterly, irredeemably person of unfit character. Remember, I got into a lot of this during the Clinton stuff where I believed all that stuff about character. He didn't know anything about anything in terms of policy.
Enthusiastically.
And he was a bully and a jerk. And he fed populism with a lot of red meat. And the people who once stood athwart a lot of that kind of stuff were like, well, what are you going to do? He's the nominee. And I get it. You can say lesser of two evils. That's a perfectly intellectually defensible position to get. The problem is that it's very, 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 very difficult for most people to sustain that kind of cognitive dissonance, that kind of cynicism. This is the point Yuval Levin, praise be upon him, makes. That cynicism doesn't last. And eventually what you end up doing is saying, no, I mean, yeah, you stop saying, well, yeah, he's our scumbag, but he's better than their scumbag. You start saying, he's not a scumbag. He's a great man. He's this great leader. And that sort of intellectual and moral transformation of a big chunk of the right, that's sort of where we used to hold up a yardstick and measure the man by it. We now take the man and bend the yardstick to fit him. And I think that is something that has gotten a lot of people on the right into a lot of trouble.
One thing that I want to ask you about is the reporting infrastructure on the right, which is something that I'm deeply interested and passionate about, and that I think you are too. Our focuses are a bit different, but I think what the right has done very successfully in the legal movement is, the Federalist Society, they built an infrastructure where smart and interested young lawyers can see a career path to being a prominent conservative attorney. And for me, and I'm sure you've experienced this at the Dispatch, talent, recruiting, retention, acquisition is a huge challenge. And why is that? Well, first of all, I think we lack institutions on the right that have the same prestige as those on the left, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. And beyond that, it's difficult for ambitious, smart young kids to see a long career where they say, I can be a prominent conservative reporter. Do you agree with that view? And then if you do, what do you think is a long-term solution for that?
Yeah, so I generally agree with that. I think that this is a big problem. I think it is a problem that, what is it James Burnham says? Problems without solutions aren't problems. It kind of gets to part of the sort of the nature of people who go into journalism generally, right? There is a reason why people of the left, broadly speaking, and it's not a criticism, are so wildly overrepresented in things like teaching, both K through 12, but also college, why they go so much more into journalism and entertainment and these kinds of things. There is a sort of a Thomas Sowell kind of unconstrained vision thing where they want to preach, they want to bring the word, they want to enlighten the people and all that kind of stuff. if you're of a basic conservative sort of bourgeois temperament, you want to get a good job. You want to make money. You want to like start a family, and you go to church and all of these kinds of things. Politics isn't your religion. And so when you start seeing that at scale, you start getting lots of people who want to be missionaries to, reform the world, who go into these kinds of professions. And a lot of the smartest, most normal conservatives, they go into accounting, they go into law, they go into these other things. And the reason why the Federalist Society is both a good and bad example is that the great thing about the Federalist Society is that it's a very successful institution for attracting conservatives, but sending them into a profession where you could still have that sort of career path that you always wanted, right? Media is kind of different. And one of the great advantages that the mainstream media have is that they so successfully lied to themselves about their own biases that they don't think that they're biased, right? And so when you start trying to attract young conservative journalists, there's a sociological problem there in that, like, ideally they would just be journalists who, lean right but are doing the same job, and it doesn't quite work that way. And so what you get is a lot of people who want to be Fox News hosts rather than like real reporters, right? And so anyway, I agree with you that it's probably one of the reasons why we wanted to found the Dispatch was to help train up people about how to do it right, kind of thing. And we don't have the infrastructure on the right. If you look at, this is part of our deck when we were pitching the Dispatch for investors. If you look at the center and go left on the media ecosystem, and we can all debate, I don't think there'd be a big debate here about where on the left, like the New York Times and the Washington Post are, or CBS or ABC or whatever. But, center left, I think, is all we would all agree. Their core mission is reporting. I mean, that's what they say. Now, the kind of choices they make for reporting and all that we can argue with, but it's like real reporting. You take the center and move right, there's not a lot, right? There's the Wall Street Journal editorial page, which is really primarily opinion, but there is reporting there. There's the Free Beacon. National Review has always had a little bit of reporting, but not really.
And I think their commitment to it has ebbed and flowed.
Yes, for sure.
So sometimes it's been robust, and at other times it has waned.
That's right. And part of the problem is that the sort of the animal spirits of the habits of the heart, the muscle memory of the right growing up after 1945 is conservatives would complain about what the mainstream media did. That was their engagement with media. Rush Limbaugh did no reporting, right? He read from the New York Times, look what the drive-by media did today, and that kind of stuff. The Corner, a big part of what made the Corner successful was we commented on what came out in the New York Times that morning. We didn't go out and find our own stuff. And so there's so much less of that. And then if you move further right, you find a lot of places that claim to be reporting, but they're just making stuff up, right?
Well, yeah. You can never go full gateway pundit.
Right. And so I think it would be good if we could figure out that balance of, so like, it's funny. I grew up in big chunk. I started reading the New Republic when I was probably 12. And
you were a fun kid
because I'm so cool.
You're a fun kid.
We'll go back between that and the Dungeons and Dragons Monster Manual, and maybe sometimes stolen Playboys. But the
funny thing is, Jonah's actually very fun.
Jonah is very fun.
Like, Jonah makes fun of himself for being a nerd, but Jonah's fun to party with.
So, but the New Republic has the old New Republic. I shouldn't say the old New Republic, but like the New Republic of the late 80s, early 90s. That is more and more in my head a model of good journalism insofar as I actually think the best journalism is is reported opinion journalism, because what you are doing is you're making an argument, and you cannot win an argument unless you first confess your priors. You confess your biases, say, here's the argument I'm trying to make, I'm going to try to address the best arguments on the other side, and here are the facts I'm going to muster to blah, 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 blah. It's sort of like the best arguments outside of journalism are in courtrooms, where you have a biased prosecutor who's biased in favor of conviction and a biased defense attorney who's biased in favor of acquittal, but they both have to obey certain rules of evidence. They all have to address the best arguments of the other side. And so I think, like, being honest about your biases is better. We at the Dispatch are open about our biases. The Washington Free Beacon is open about its biases. It doesn't mean it's not good reporting. And I think we need more of that. We also need more conservatives at the Washington Post and the New York Times and those kinds of places. We need people who come at stories from a different perspective, rather than the reigning definition of diversity at a lot of these institutions is a bunch of people who have different skin tones, different genders, and that number is exploding, but all basically think alike. And that's not how you get actually healthy journalism.
I totally agree with that. And the thing that I said this on a panel at AEI too, where I think Charles Lane was moderating, and somehow the question came up that, well, what I'm going to garble the question, but I sort of said, yeah, the difference between the Beacon and the Washington Post or the New York Times, okay, we're smaller and barely anyone's heard of us. However, we say who we are.
Right.
They're trying to tell you they're not biased. Right. And there's a great honesty in that. That is, like, just don't tell us you're right down the middle, guys.
Right. I agree with that entirely.
Come on.
And that is the...
And for those of us, like you or like me, who say we're conservative, we know the ideology when we see it.
Right.
You're not fooling us.
Right. Well, so this gets back to, like, you growing up in the Midwest and liberal areas, me growing up in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Conservatives, as a rule, are better at passing ideological Turing tests than liberals are, because we're minorities in a majority culture. So we know, what the liberal position is on stuff. Liberals don't actually understand conservative positions. And that's when you get that kind of groupthink at a place like the New York Times or the Washington Post, where they're like, like this flag stuff with Alito. We don't have to get into the weeds. It's not great.
We just talked about it.
But they don't know what they don't know, and so they come at it from the worst possible interpretation on everything. And sometimes the worst interpretation is right, but usually not.
I just had an argument with somebody at a cocktail party about this. Was
it a Georgetown?
It actually was a Georgetown cocktail party, a book party for a friend of mine, and this person is at a big network and was saying, we have conservatives, we have this person who starts ticking off to me their conservative credentials, and I said, yeah, I worked in the mainstream media too. I know how to blend among those people.
Yeah.
How you blend is you don't talk about your political views, and that is what everyone who's gone from the conservative media to the mainstream does. They're such that once they go, there's no distinction between them and all the rest of the people who are liberals. You just keep your mouth shut and become no different from them. But that's my rant. But their test for who's a conservative is they're from this place and their parents are conservative and they have conservative credentials. That's not actually how you contribute to a place as a conservative.
One of the problems that we confront is in getting enough commodity news, in getting enough basic facts, things that are reported out, and where the New York Times and where the major networks still have the great advantage is somebody's got to get the election results, right? Somebody's got to get the box scores for the game. Somebody has to do foreign reporting. Somebody has to do all of that. And it's just really, really, really expensive.
Right.
It costs an enormous amount of money. One of the things that I'm most proud about being associated with the Dispatch is that you and Steve have made a commitment to do it a harder way, right? Like, okay, we got to send somebody out there. We're going to have to actually report on this. We're going to have to actually do it. It's a lot cheaper.
It's a great moneymaker, isn't it, Jonah?
Just
rolling in cash.
Rakes in cash.
Yeah.
But a lot cheaper way to do it is to let the legacy media outlets do all the legwork and do the reporting, and then we'll just sort through it, right?
We'll just pick off your plate.
Yeah, we'll just pick off your plate. We'll take that. Oh, yeah, that was, And then the best part is, and this was a Fox News classic, was this report that says da-da-da, the liberal New York Times. You're like, you got that from the liberal New York Times.
Exactly.
You wouldn't know that if the liberal New York Times had not reported that. So you're complaining about the bias of a story that you are quoting from to attack it, which can be fair comment, right? How many columns have I ever gotten out of something that the New York Times put in the 18th paragraph, and you're like, well, boys, this is actually the lead. I think you're going to want to go ahead and move that up to the top. But the having more, doing the expensive hard work of this stuff against entrenched legacy outfits is hard. It's expensive. It's very challenging.
Yeah, it's really difficult. I remember at National Review, Rich and I wanted to get a Capitol Hill gossip columnist, and it never really occurred to me why reporting was so. That's how I learned really why reporting is so expensive. Because it turns out, as you both know, most rumors in Washington turn out not to be true.
You mean the cocaine parties are not?
But so you can have
a reporter
misinformed. You can have a reporter doing the job perfectly and get nothing for it, because what they've done is they've chased it down and confirmed that the story is not true. And then what are you going to do? Right. And so there's a lot of manpower involved in reporting that isn't involved in opinion. I mean, you can put me down right now, give me any article from a mainstream outlet, and I can give you 800 words on it in 45 minutes.
Beyond that, you can have the story of the year.
Yeah.
And it could take a month.
Yeah.
And you can get one story out of it.
Right.
Yep. When I was in my brief foray into local TV news, they put me in charge of the investigations team, the I team, and they said, okay, and we need something in February, whatever sweeps was coming up. I was like, well, we don't have anything. It's like, well, we got to launch this thing. You got to have something. I'm like, well, we don't.
Right.
And that taught me this enormous lesson as a young journalist of like, when they spend money on things, they want things from things.
Right.
So what you're saying is I've got to give you something. And I believe it did lead to I participated, we filmed an undercover prostitution bust. Was our first big I-Team expose. And we blew the lid off the fact that people go to hookers. That was our big, we got to the bottom of the big story because we had to bring something in time for Sweeps Week.
You should have gone into the woods and proved that bears are using our national forest as toilets.
Jonah, I want to ask you about leaving Fox and joining CNN, and then a couple questions after that, and we will release you.
Yeah.
So you and Steve together decided to leave Fox, and this is after you joined the Dispatch. You stayed on as Fox News commentators, and you wrote an op-ed about this, and you said, people keep asking me, why did it take so long? The short answer is we hoped and had reason to believe that Fox would get back on course, and we wanted to help it get there. If your view is that Fox News was always irredeemably bad, that explanation will fall flat. I can't help you there. But for us, the release of Patriot Purge, and that's a reference to Tucker Carlson's hour-long documentary that was released on Fox Nation, their streaming service, was proof that waiting for Fox to get back on track would be like waiting for Godot. Talk about the decision to leave and what were your concerns before you left and why you ultimately left, because of course there was a lot of bad stuff that happened before then.
So Steve will give a slightly different answer on this than I would. For me, it was the last straw. For Steve, it was by itself reason to quit. So part of my problem at Fox, since the rise of Trump, was, first of all, the stuff that I mentioned earlier about people just going on TV and just doing partisan talking points that they didn't actually believe. But it was also the expectation
Is it better if they believe it?
It's creepier, but I think 90% of journalistic ethics issues are solved by the simple rule of don't write or say things you don't believe to be true, right? Truth is always its own defense. And but part of my problem was, and in Fox's defense, they didn't just, Trump wanted me fired from Fox. He wanted me fired from National Review, wanted all sorts of things. They didn't let me go because I was anti-Trump. But what they did do was just simply stop asking me anything about Donald Trump. For years, it was like, come on and talk about why Nancy Pelosi's statement is so outrageous. And I was like, I'm fine to talk about how her statement was outrageous because it was outrageous, and I don't like Nancy Pelosi, and that's all fine. But it got to the point where it was a really powerful insight for me, where you start to see how Fox, as a matter of editorial policy, got to the point where if you heard criticism of Donald Trump, it was from one of their House liberals or House Democrats, right? Until you got to the point where the normal Fox addict out in flyover country or wherever who was watching Fox, they would reasonably infer that if you have a problem with Donald Trump, it must be because you're a liberal. And I felt like this was a really profound violation. Again, I care more about conservatism than I do about the Republican Party. I care about intellectual integrity. I felt like I was, by omission, part of a lie. And that really started to bother me, particularly as Fox got crazier and crazier, as the opinion side started to swamp the news side, as Roger Ailes, post-Roger, I mean, like Chris and I have talked about this many times. We can all stipulate that Roger Ailes was a flawed human being. I think that is a easily defended assertion. I've often said that he was the weirdest mix of Aristotle and Boss Hogg I ever met. But the post-Roger Ailes Fox was much worse. Yeah. And that's something that a lot of people don't understand, is that Roger, whatever problems you had with him, and there are plenty of problems to have, actually had a pretty sincere and well-honed commitment to the integrity of the news division. I think they lost that after Roger left.
And I think a sincere patriotism, too.
For sure. And so over time, I just got increasingly fed up with all of the stupidity, all of the weirdness, all of the Trump, leg humping. And I should say, over this period, Steve and I, and sometimes this was conveyed through people who happen to be sitting between you and I right now, was that the word was coming forth that after this election or after this or next year, we're going to pivot back to doing serious stuff. We're going to pivot back. We need voices like you. We need to lean into the Charles Crownhammer and lean away from the buffoonery. And that's the waiting for Godot thing, is that eventually the logic of just monetizing the hell out of ratings and old people who can't get the nurse to bring them the remote to change the channel was taking over everything. And then the Patriot Purge comes out and says, okay, the mere fact that this thing was allowed to be developed, this thing which claimed that January 6th was basically a false flag operation intended to justify creating American gitmos to put MAGA people in prison, was just more than a bridge too far. It was a continent too far. And I was like, I'm done. This shows that they can't change. I'm out of here.
If I may, the idea that Godot was coming, the idea that how I rationalized, things started to get weird at Fox in a more profound way in like 2015. Mm-hmm. There had been unsettling signs, and then in about 2015, the arrival of Trump definitely exposed a lot. And in hindsight, I look back and I see how much I was rationalizing. Mm-hmm. No. Paul Ryan's going on the board, and mm-hmm. Look, there are good things. And my confirmation bias led me to say, "Ooh, no, this is going to be good. Here's another good thing that happened." I was clinging to those intently, and I can definitely see that in hindsight.
There's definitely a boiling frog thing that,
Yeah, for sure. And once the way that you and Steve conducted yourselves around that, I thought was exemplary. And it was easy for me. I got shot out of a cannon, so I didn't have to. I didn't have to think about it. Right? It was done to me, not by me. And the way that you and Steve did it, which was, this is why. You acknowledged your priors. You came out, and I've said this before, but it is very true, that you conducted yourself like gentlemen. You conducted yourself like grown-ups, and you didn't do the thing that I hate, which is when people leave a thing or a place, and the scales have fallen from my eyes. I now can say that this place is a whorehouse. I didn't know it. I came in because I like the piano player, and I am shocked to find out that this has been going on here.
The full Stuart Stevens.
The full Stuart Stevens. Yes.
All right. So let's talk about you then joined CNN as a commentator. Why do you think that they didn't exactly cover themselves in glory in the Trump years? I would not say they're covering themselves in glory now. I was a contributor at CNN during the couple of the Trump years. We do CNN together from time to time now. But why did you think that in terms of being a paid contributor, it was less objectionable to, like, to you?
Well,
to join up with them.
So first of all, I agree with you. CNN did not cover itself in glory during the Trump years. I think CNN is aware of this and is trying to get better. It is not following the MSNBC model. I will say that. That said, it's probably best I don't get too deep in the weeds on all that stuff. But part of it was, at CNN, I could be more of my whole self. I could, at Fox, literally, it's not like people were yelling in my ear through the IFB, don't talk about Trump. It was that the topic selection was always such that I was never given the opportunity to talk about Trump. And so I felt like I was complicit in this idea where I come, halfway in a show between a wildly pro-Trump interview and right before another wildly pro-Trump interview, and people just think, oh, I'm part of that general parade of pro-Trump people. And it's really funny. I Howie Kurtz, who does that media show, a rival media criticism product to this fine podcast.
No. We're beneath contempt. We're just wretches.
And Howie wanted me to come on and talk about, the left's cancel culture stuff. And I can't even remember what the news hook for it was. And I made the point, you can find it on YouTube. I made the point that the left has a real cancel culture problem. So does the right. The current president of the United States loves canceling people. And Howie, you could almost hear, despite its distance from his microphone, the sudden onset emptying of his bowels, as he's like, "Oh crap, we're gonna get Trump criticism here."
We thought we had constructed the cage to hold Jonah, and he has reached a paw out and unlatched it.
So anyway, at CNN, I will say this: it is very difficult for people to understand what kind of creature I am at CNN, because I will say bad things about Donald Trump, and then I will say bad things about Joe Biden.
Yeah.
I will say Donald Trump is completely guilty of the things that he's basically being accused of in the Alvin Bragg case, and the Alvin Bragg case is garbage. And this is part of the problems with cable news environment generally, is that, and this gets to my point about the corruption that comes from thinking if you're a conservative, your job is to always defend Republicans, or thinking if you're a liberal, your job is to always defend Democrats, is the conflation of party operative people with journalists. And so the anatomy, the way cable news works is, if it's a Democrat in the White House, we'll bring on conservatives to criticize the president. If it's a Republican in the White House, we'll bring on liberals to criticize the president. And you're often put, I'm sure both of you have had this experience, where you're put on sometimes on a panel where the person you're supposed to argue with is an outright paid flack of the Democratic Party. And so they will take whatever position is the position du jour because they are doing client work. And then you're stuck in this position where you have to either, if you make any concession, well, I think George Bush made a mistake with that speech. Even Jonah agrees that George Bush is a fascist, right?
Yeah.
And so it sticks you in this rhetorical trap. And I think the beginning of this problem, actually the beginning of the problem, the best sort of chapter illustrative chapter of this was, remember the Jon Stewart on Crossfire stuff?
Yes.
We reference it frequently.
Yeah.
Here.
So like Bob Novak, when Bob Novak, I have big problems with Bob Novak, departed Bob Novak. But Bob Novak actually believed in some things. Some of them, he was a very anti-Israel guy. I think really problematically so.
Oh, I forgot about that. I forgot.
When we were pitching the Dispatch, we used to say, and Steve's going to do a reported column, sort of like Bob Novak, without the anti-Semitism. And but like they brought on Carville and Begala, who in this current climate, they're charming guys. Begala in particular, I've become friendly with. But their job was just to be party hacks.
Yeah.
And Novak wouldn't take positions that he didn't actually believe. And there was this mismatch. And that's what they like in cable news. And so, like, I kind of enjoy being the skunk at the garden party where they put me on panels sometimes with pro-Trump people and anti-Trump people. And I'm like, he's 50% right and she's 50% right, which is another way of saying she's 50% wrong and he's 50% wrong. And I get to be my whole self. I don't take TV all that seriously anymore. I used to think it was really cool to be on TV. I think it's important for the Dispatch. It's important for business reasons. It's good to be paid to do it because if you feel like you have to do it anyway, it's better to be compensated for it. But I don't. My happiest days, and no one at CNN will. If you wanted to go deep dive reporting on this, you'll get nothing but confirmation. My happiest days are when I get bumped and don't have to go on to TV. I really just I don't hate it, but I don't love driving across town to talk for 4 minutes and then have to come home.
I have very much enjoyed, and Kevin Williamson and I have talked about this. We've talked to you about this. I came at all of this from a different. I grew up in a very conservative family, a National Review subscribing family. If I voted, I don't know how I don't know how I would vote if I voted, but I definitely came at life. I embraced journalism as a 17-year-old and got into it. Mm-hmm. I was like into it. And I have enjoyed watching you, like, I don't know how to describe it, but be free, right? Mm-hmm. I love Jonah Unbound. I love Jonah Free. And because you are so well rooted in philosophy and because you have read so much and know so much and have so much history, and I learned so much, every time I listen to a Remnant, I end up buying a book that I make my son read. I'm not going to read it, but I make him read it. And you have all of this depth, and I feel like in the post-Fox era, in the Dispatch era, there is a freedom in you, a freeness in you that is very appealing and very helpful.
Well, I appreciate it. I mean, as I often say, I've never been more politically homeless, but more ideologically grounded, because this process of the last almost decade, I now get to figure out, like, do I believe this because that's what the team requires, or do I believe this because I believe it? And it turns out there are a lot of anti-Trump people or never Trump people who turned out they didn't believe any of their stuff.
Yeah.
And they've just basically become Democrats, right? And then there are other people who are like, I still believe this stuff. And it bums me out that the Republican Party, to one extent or another, doesn't anymore. But there's a role for it. I think partisanship is underappreciated in journalism because sometimes it's the only motivation to get people to track down new facts that are necessary for understanding what's really going on. And that often gets overlooked. It's like partisanship, not just among journalists, but among, activists and stuff and parties in general. It's what motivates you to figure out how to prove the other side is wrong. And if you didn't have it, you wouldn't have the adversarial system that we have. And I always say democracy is about disagreement, not about agreement. And so if that's the case, then you need a little partisanship out there. But for me, I've just lost any of the attraction to sort of like waving the big foam number one finger, GOP, rah, rah, rah. And I don't always begrudge other people for doing it. It depends on the context, but I'm not going to lie for Donald Trump. And that's where I come out of it.
It's cool. It's cool.
I want to close asking you two questions. The first is for young people listening to this, and we get notes from college students a lot. What do you look for
Nerds.
when you hire? And what stories are you proudest of over the course of your career, and why?
Yeah. Okay. So circle back to the second one, but just the caveat that, like, I am primarily an opinion journalist. I've done some reporting, but usually most of my reporting is like, let's send Jonah someplace weird and have him write funny things about it, right? So, like,
an underrated genre,
I
if I
agree.
may say.
Well, I would say, like, Andrew Stiles, who was our colleague at National Review and is now at the Beacon, like, he does that stuff wonderfully.
He's great. Yeah, I don't.
I think those are wonderful stories.
I wish I had time.
And Andy Ferguson does that fabulously.
I agree, and PJ was the model of it. I'm not, and Matt Labash, has done some fantastic stuff like that. I'm not denigrating it. I'm just saying, like, I haven't done a lot of, like, reporting, in part because I've never been able to talk to politicians and have them lie to me without getting into an argument.
But what's a piece when you look back and you think, especially to when you were younger, you mentioned the story, the piece that you wrote for the Journal.
Uh-huh.
But when you look back at these are moments, these are pieces I wrote that I knew were inflection points, or they hit.
Yeah, so, like, you guys were talking earlier about, like, not your father's National Review kind of thing. I think when I wrote my column, my G-File, which is the name of this newsletter thing I do, I don't know. When I wrote the G-File on what was the single most Burkean line from Animal House, it was signaling that I was trying to come up with a syncretic, mix of what is great and enduring about conservatism and National Review, but also translating it into sort of a vernacular for a new generation kind of thing. I don't know. I really liked, I got a big splash. It was a big deal for me professionally, the Anwar piece where I went up to Alaska and wrote about Anwar.
You had insider knowledge.
I did, although I was only dating the Fair Jessica at the time.
Anything to get the byline, anything to get the dateline. This guy got married for a story. I'm just saying.
Right. That's totally what happened. And I don't know. I'm very proud of The Corner. I'm very proud of my role in creating The Corner, and which is not an article, but it's a gestalt that I thought was very important and good for the magazine and good for the cause. I actually, now that you mentioned my wife, the lovely and talented Fair Jessica, I did get my wife through the Wall Street Journal in,
like, by mail.
Different publication gets that kind of way. After the contract with America, Newt Gingrich Congress, right? There are a lot of young conservatives in Washington who were. This is back when you were either in kindergarten or not alive yet, Eliana. But, like, there were a lot of conservatives in Washington who just thought they were too cool for school, right? And there was all of this, we're going to have our own culture and our own this and all that. And there were these cigar parties, and everyone wanted to be PJ O'Rourke, and they were wearing fedoras, and the Weekly Standard was writing all this garbage about how, they're going to create this entire conservative alternate culture and blah, 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 blah. And everyone was so smug and so full of themselves. And we had these no left turn parties and all blah, 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 blah. So
This is like when was it Newsweek? Who did the cover? The New Conservative.
It was the New York Times Magazine.
Times Magazine.
So that's another piece I would take, pivoting to the piece thing. I wrote a piece. I believe I coined this concept, which has now been stolen by everybody, of the conservatives in the mist coverage, where
I steal it all the time.
Where it was a reference, was it Diane Fossey?
Yes.
Who wrote
Gorillas in the Mist.
Gorillas in the Mist, and I really do believe I coined it. I'm open to correction, where the New York Times would go forth and find conservatives on a college campus or someplace else and say, "Look at them; they're so much like us. They love their young, and they eat, with utensils just like normal people, and, like, they're always shocked to find out that conservatives are actually human beings." Anyway, I wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal making fun of the sort of new conservative counterculture in Washington. My wife loved that piece and said to a mutual friend, who we all know, Ken Weinstein, at the Hudson Institute.
Of course.
He's the guy who introduced me to my wife. This is the classic Washington conservative meet cute story. Ken was like, oh, I know that guy. Yeah. And so at another one of these, like, they were called no left turn parties, young right wingers, Ken introduces me to Jessica, and I was smitten, impressed. I was dating someone, she was dating someone, whatever. But That's when I first met her. I owed it all to Ken. But then the next day, Ken, who never called me, calls me and says, for reasons that we don't need to get into on this podcast, yeah, Jonah, I hear you like Jessica. That's great. That's great. Just so you know, she's way out of your league. And this filled me with so much rage that I then started a years-long quest.
So George Will's roasting of you at AEI led to your career in journalism. And Ken Weinstein telling you that you were out of Jessica's league led to your eventual betrothal and happy marriage.
Yeah, pretty much.
So spite is the key. That's the young people. Take that away, Jonah. The lesson from Jonah Goldberg.
Has your daughter written Ken a thank you note?
Exactly. It's the spite that does it.
Anyway, so that was, for the record, that was William F. Buckley's advice to George Will. When George Will got his syndicated column, George called Bill and said, how the hell am I going to write 2 columns a week? And Bill said, look, at least 2 things a week are going to annoy you. Write about that.
And George carries around his card where he writes down.
Whenever something pisses himself off, he writes down a little. Anyway, so advice for young people, I have a lot of it, particularly for journalists. I'm not so sure. But so for starters, gosh. So the question is just like how to get into journalism and all that kind of stuff?
I would say it's not how to get into it, but for those who want, for aspiring journalists, for people who may want to work at the Dispatch, like what is your general advice for them? It could be anything.
Okay, so first of all, and I know we have a bleeper here, so I'll
get ready, Colin.
No, I'll boulderize, self-boulderize. We at the Dispatch, we kind of fell over backwards into it, but we have a very strict no a-hole rule. You have to not be a jerk. You have to not treat your colleagues disrespectfully. Part of it has to do with the fact that a lot of our early staffers were refugees from sort of the magnification of the right generally, but also of places like the World magazine. So you get these young, earnest Christian kids who were kind of horrified by some of that stuff. And now we really value that, and we think it's really important.
I will say that how do you describe yourself, a demi-Jew from the Upper West Side?
Pseudo-intellectual demi-Jew from the Upper West Side of Manhattan.
For a pseudo-intellectual demi-Jew from the Upper West Side of Manhattan, you spend a lot of time with us Christian. You have really fallen in with bad company.
I do. I mean, I was at National Review, which is this.
Yeah, you went from the
Papist.
Vatican. Yeah, you went from the papacy over here to we've got our hands in the air while we're singing Amazing Grace. Yeah, it's been a real journey for you, John.
And my wife, when she worked for John Ashcroft, she was the one who would bring in the fresh snakes to handle. But anyway, so first of all, but don't be an a-hole. Don't be an a-hole thing. I think is actually really important advice for young people generally. A lot of really smart young people come to Washington D.C. in particular, and they bring with them this campus politics mindset of wanting to pick fights, of getting really worked up about small ego nonsense. And the problem is, particularly in this profession, in this town, sorry to use that phrase, you pick an enemy, you're going to have that enemy for the next 40 friggin' years, and you're going to see him everywhere you go.
Yeah.
So you pick your enemies carefully. I'm not saying don't pick enemies, but don't do it over petty, weird stuff, because it just is going to create problems for you over time. Sorry.
You'll be fine.
Second,
just 30 years to go.
Making enemies over petty things is like my it's like my superpower.
My generic advice for young people when they come to Washington, and part of this has to do with my own personal experiences with a lot of internships and working for Wattenberg and all that stuff, is do not have an ego about doing crap work when you at an entry level. If you're working for a really busy person and you do the crap work, get coffee, all that, dry cleaning, whatever, and I do not have people who work for me do that kind of stuff. But if you're asked to
I think
do that
one
kind
of your
stuff,
interns is still shackled in the hallway outside the studio, but that's fine, Jonah. You tell people what you want to tell them.
I do make him clean up his own GIMP box, but the really busy people, when they give work to young people who work for them, entry-level people, and the kids do it really, really well, they don't say, wow, this guy's really good at getting coffee. That's all I'm ever going to do. What they're doing is they're testing how well you handle different levels of responsibility. And if you are not a pain in the ass about it, if you are polite, if you are eager and enthusiastic, very quickly the level of responsibility being assigned to you will grow. And they're going to test to see where you kind of level out and what you can handle. And the easiest way to short circuit that process is to just send the signal that you're difficult to make, to ask to do things, right? Be of good cheer. I mean, there's a reason why George Stephanopoulos basically ran Capitol Hill before he was 30, is because every task he was given, he executed with good cheer and a good attitude. That's one of those things that I think attitudinally I look for in young people, and it's a really important piece of advice, particularly for kids who come from like these Ivy League schools and they think they're too good to answer phones or too good to go get coffee or whatever. And that they think, because they've worked their way through the meritocracy to the second rung of a very tall ladder, they think, okay, now it's time to be rewarded because I've checked all these boxes. And, that's when you should start hustling, not when you think, okay, the payoff comes.
Nate Moore victimized. You just victimized Princeton graduate Nate Moore. Hardest hit. Hardest hit.
Other than that, I'm a bit, again, I resent having to be the guy who talks about integrity, but have integrity.
Yeah.
And value your integrity, because it's not just that you should care about your reputation. It's that the more you start making compromises really young, selling off little bits of your integrity, the easier it becomes over time to rationalize doing it at scale. And other than that, I think it's like this is a point I get from my dad. My dad hired probably hundreds, I don't know, thousands of journalists over his career. Don't go to journalism school.
Amen.
And
that is correct.
And if you, at the very least, even if you do go to journalism school, know something about something. This town, you cannot swing a dead raccoon, which Chris brings from home.
Yeah, check me later. Check me out.
He has
Catch
a whole
me outside.
trunk full of dead raccoons without hitting some really smart kid.
Yeah,
we're smart kids here at AEI. The place is full of all these interns and visiting college students, and they're like roaches in an old fridge in a tenement. Smart kids. They're just all over the place. Open the fridge door and all these little Princeton buggers are like looking at you bright-eyed. I don't give a rat's ass that you're smart. What do you know, right? And that's what journalists, in particular, have an expertise, have a field of expertise that you bring some set of knowledge to. And the other thing is, the great thing about being young that all us olds like me and Chris are incredibly jealous of, though we won't always admit it, is you can afford to be poor.
Yes.
And what I mean by that is you can afford to be entrepreneurial with your time in a way I couldn't. I went off to Prague after college, had a great time. If I tried to do that today, I'd lose a couple jobs, I'd lose a business, I'd lose a house, I'd lose a car, I'd lose a wife. I can't do it. Things own me. When you're young, you can go off and do weird stuff, acquire experiences and expertise that you're not going to be able to do later.
Contacts.
Friendships, all that stuff, right? Washington will always be there waiting for you. I think all three of us have probably known a gazillion people who disappeared for like 2 years.
Yeah.
Like, for whatever reason, grad school, go to work in Hong Kong for the Wall Street Journal, whatever. They come back, it's like they were never gone. Go acquire some real experience outside of Washington that gives you a better sense of the things you don't know. And lastly, if you do want to be a journalist or a writer, again, I'm more of an opinion guy, writers write. Writers don't necessarily get published, but writers write. And if you want to be a writer, first of all, you should read a lot, but also you should write a lot. And whether it's a journal or a blog or drafts of op-eds that you're going to get rejected for all the time, that's fine. But part of the reason why I have been able to do this for a quarter century now, which is a really depressing thing to say, is I have stick-to-itiveness. A lot of people in our business, like at National Review, every few years there'd be some like new flavor of the day. It was like really popular and all this kind of stuff. And then 5 years later, I was like, what was that guy's name again? And partly it's just they just realized they couldn't do it day in and day out because they didn't love it enough. And that's fine. But the ones who make a career out of it are the ones who actually enjoy it enough that they get the muscle memory, that they know how to do it because this is actually what they want to do. And the only way you discover that is by doing it until you either burn out or discover it's your thing. And the earlier you start writing, the earlier you're going to figure out what's good for you. I loved being a television producer until my learning curve leveled off. And I was like, yeah, this is not for me. I like writing because I like owning what goes on the page. And anyway, I can do this
and it's
for a
fun.
long time. But.
And it's fun. If you like it, it's fun. And if you don't, I always tell people it's a huge lie when they say, do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. That is an absolute lie.
Yeah.
But
there are days where it is work.
But you will not be willing to do the work if you do not love it, right? You will not, unless you love it, you will not be able to impel yourself into the work if you do not love it. Jonah, we have squandered so much of your time here. We have taken advantage of your friendship and your good offices.
Thank you so much for doing this.
To come in here and talk to us. You never explained why.
I didn't know this is what I was getting into. I honestly, you didn't tell me that this was going to be the Jonah Goldberg story. I thought we were just going to do rank punditry.
You never explained why my new picture at the Dispatch looks like Mr. Furley wearing an ankle monitor. I'm a Don Knotts. I'm a Don Knotts guy, so I'm for it. But
we can still tweak these things, right? So Kevin Williamson's response, everyone was asked for, like, what do you think of the picture or whatever.
Right.
I don't like mine because it looks like I'm trying to make like a bunny sound. There's just a little bit of my teeth coming out.
You look like actually a guy who's standing outside of a piano bar trying to get people. You look wild. There is a wildness in your drawing that I like, but is wild.
It's sort of my Dorian Gray portrait. And Steve, immediately the second I saw Steve Hayes's, I was like, that is the Unabomber getting cleaned up for his arraignment.
Yeah.
But Kevin Williamson's response was the best to his, where he just said, it looks like me, but other than that, it's fine.
Nah. I told Kevin he looks like he's getting dressed up to liquidate the kulaks. He has a real...
He does.
There's that. But anyway, we're really grateful to you, Jonah.
Happy to
Thank
do it.
you.
That is all the time we have for this interview edition of Ink-Stained Wretches. This has been Ink-Stained Wretches from Nebulous Media, produced by Colin Chicola. Find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for Wretches.